You ain't nothing but a hound dog, you're crying all the time.
With the United States' early reluctance to join World War II, the already tense relationship with Russia grew even tenser as millions of Russians died throughout the war. Following the defeat of Germany, the Soviet Union was a ruined state politically and economically. The Russians understood that they had to put up a facade to make it appear as they were a rival to the U.S., and much to the U.S. dismays, they did an excellent job.
The Soviet Union determined that the best way to make the world respect their communist ideology was to spread their beliefs. America, the poster boy for democracy, adopted the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine was American foreign policy which focused on containing communism has to be contained. The Truman Doctrine made it clear that America would take a strong stand against the communism international spread, while many Russians were starving and some so desperate that they sold their children. The Soviet Union was in competition with the U.S. to make the world's first functioning rocket. The Cold War was fraught with accomplishments and the threat of nuclear annihilation, a chance for communism and democracy to prove once and for all which one was better. By 1949, the Soviet Union and the U.S. both had nuclear capabilities, but had no good way to deliver the bombs accurately over a long range. Planes were easy to detect and had the problem of human error, so the next logical choice was to design a rocket to deliver a nuclear warhead. As a result of the arms race and emerging space race, the Russians first succeeded with launching a satellite into space. Sputnik became the world's first orbiting satellite. As a result of the Soviets' success with the rocket, the U.S. determined to not allow the Russians to win the arms race. President Eisenhower made it America's mission to advance education by expanding mathematics and sciences. Atomic bombs were tested throughout the Cold War, with each test more successful and devastating than the one before. As a result, the Cold War issued a nearly 50-year period in which Americans feared not an invading army but a reign of nuclear annihilation.
President Franklin D. Roosevelt started working on the Servicemen's Bill for returning World War II soldiers because he wanted to make sure that what happened to World War I veterans did not happen again. World War I veterans had a hard time getting back to normal life, and many dealt with depression. The Servicemen's Bill went to Congress in January 1944 while the war continued to rage in the European and Pacific fronts. The Servicemen's Bill was hotly debated in both congressional houses, but was finally approved in mid-June. President Roosevelt signed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944 into law. This bill became commonly referred to as the GI Bill. It was designed to alleviate the stress of returning veterans and help prevent a return to the conditions of the Great Depression. The GI Bill helped veterans pay for college, access hospitals, and receive low-interest mortgages for home purchases. Those who wished to continue their education in college or vocational school could do so tuition-free up to $500 with a monthly living expense. As a result, nearly 49% of college admissions by 1947 were veterans. The GI Bill opened a door for higher education in the working class in a way previously unavailable. The bill provided a $20 weekly unemployment benefit for up to 1 year for veterans looking for work. The government guaranteed loans for veterans who borrowed money to purchase homes, businesses, or farms. For African Americans who had served in World War II, they received college tuition, yet they had few selections because many colleges were still segregated. The GI Bill continues to benefit veterans and has become a foundation for many Americans to obtain training and higher education.
Dwight Eisenhower was the 34th President of the United States. He was born in Texas on October 14, 1890, and he died on March 28, 1969. Eisenhower was a Republican and led 2 terms in his presidency. During World War II, he was a 5-star general and led the Allied forces during D-Day. During his 2 terms, he tried to dial down Cold War tensions. The Cold War was waged as the threat of nuclear weapons dominated foreign policy for both the U.S. and the Soviet Union. As president, Eisenhower accomplished negotiating an armistice to end the fight against Korea, promising protection for South Vietnam from Ho Chi Minh, and provided the proposition for the Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960. These Civil Rights Acts helped extinguish discrimination and expanded voting rights and protections.
On June 29, 1956, he signed legislation funding the construction of the U.S. interstate highway system. This act created a transport system that was for both civilian and military usage. The overpasses were built high so that military vehicles could pass under them. Since the 1950s, the interstate system has expanded to over 46,000 miles. Eisenhower has left a lasting impact on the United States. There is even a museum devoted to him in Abilene, Kansas, where he has spent most of his childhood and is today buried.
Historians and researchers use the word boom to describe 1950s America. This boom includes the economy, children, and expansion of the suburbs. After World War II tore civilization apart in Europe and Asia, American soldiers returned home and contributed to a growing population as they had babies and began a post-war life centered around family and home ownership. As families grew, the demand for affordable homes increased. Some of the first suburbs were very expensive. William Levitt became the forerunner of affordable suburb housing. The first Levittown was completed in 1952. This Levittown was located in New York. Alongside building suburban homes, grocery stores, schools, churches, and parks were built that made it easier to access everyday needs. Many Levittowns started popping up all around the Northeast.
The suburbs became part of the American dream for small families in the 50s. Children could play with their neighbors and ride their bikes until it became dark outside. The houses in these Levittowns were the most affordable houses on the market. The average cost of a Levittown home was around $7,000. Most houses came with 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and no basement. Within a span of 4 years, Levitt built 17,447 houses. This averages to about 12 finished houses a day. Their construction speed and location choice made the move to these towns fast and convenient. Levitt became the most popular house building company during the 1950s. Although most houses were identical, they became a great fit for young American families.
In the 1950s, television influenced people's daily life and playing a major role in what people bought and who they voted for. The first president to use television for campaigning was Dwight Eisenhower. His TV campaign ad, I Like Ike, portrayed a likable, trustworthy Eisenhower created by Walt Disney's brother, Roy Disney. Today, unless you are 30 years old, television isn't as relevant, normally used as a news source and not much else. Ironically, news broadcasting was the original intent for televised programming during the 1950s. Young people today have gravitated toward Netflix, Hulu, and YouTube and move farther away from television each year. Television producers quickly learned what their viewers wanted and how to combine entertainment with advertising. Producers learned that their audience expanded to young people. Daytime viewers largely consisted of mothers and their children who would be at home with the TV on while fathers were out working. Television programming has made an impact on American society. Many critics have dubbed the 1950s as the golden age of television, with shows like Leave It to Beaver, Andy Griffith, and The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. Until the late 1950s, TV sets were expensive and so the audience was generally affluent. By the 1960s, the affordability of TVs meant that 90% of American homes included a television.
Rock and roll emerged as a mainstream music genre in the 1950s. Many icons from the 50s were rock and roll artists such as Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry. Their music became celebrated and listened to internationally, influencing music artists around the world. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, is one of the most recognizable names in music history. To this day, he holds the 4th highest selling single of all time with his 1960s hit, It's Now or Never.
Controversial for the 1950s when Elvis appeared on television, shaking his hips and performing the Hound Dog. American youth fell in love, while older conservative America questioned television's influence on American culture. Elvis brought rock and roll into mainstream America, blurring the lines between what had been considered black-only and white-only music. Rock and roll integrated years before society.
Brown v. Board of Education was a landmark Supreme Court case in 1954 in which the justices ruled unanimously that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. Brown v. Board of Education was one of the major events that helped the civil rights movement progress greatly and helped establish the precedent that separate but equal education and other services were not, in fact, equal at all. In the lawsuit, Brown claimed black children were not equal to white children. In 1954, large portions of the United States had racially segregated schools, made legal by Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, which held that Segregated public facilities were constitutional, so long as the black and white facilities were equal to each other. However, by the mid-20th century, civil rights groups set up legal and political challenges to racial segregation. In the early 1950s, NAACP lawyers brought class action lawsuits on behalf of black school children and their families in Kansas, South Carolina, Virginia, and Delaware, seeking court orders to compel school districts to let black students attend white public schools. In the end, state-sanctioned segregation in public schools became a violation of the 14th Amendment and was therefore unconstitutional.
A nonviolent protest is the act of expressing actions and opinions without violence. Mohandas Gandhi contributed to the political usage of nonviolent protesting as he led India's independence movement by speaking softly and facing the British with nonviolent protest. Mohandas did not understand why the use of violence was necessary, because it was easy to express your feelings without violence and it was more effective for him. Gandhi's methods, however, went beyond civil disobedience. Instead of limiting himself to judgment, he organized peaceful protests and coupled America's own Henry David Thoreau methods with resistance. Some good methods to express yourself without violence is public speeches, petitions, banners, flags, silence, and walkouts. Rosa Parks' experience included the use of nonviolence when she took a seat in a white-only section of the bus. She protested racism, but without violence. She declared, "I would like to be known as the person who is concerned about freedom and equality and justice and prosperity for all people."
On December 1st, 1955, after Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat. In 1961, a protest was organized where African Americans rode the bus to segregated areas. The bus boycotts in the 1950s contributed to growth in civil rights that reached in the late 1960s. In 1968, the leader of the nonviolent protests, Martin Luther King Jr., was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Today, people continue to follow the examples of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King by protesting peacefully to promote their message. The legacy of nonviolent protest continues in America.
The Relocation Act of 1956 incentivized Native Americans to leave their reservation and move to the city. The federal government wanted Native Americans to relocate to the city and join mainstream society by integrating into American life. While the act did not force natives to leave their reserves, it greatly encouraged their transition into American life. While in the city, many Native Americans faced job discriminations and they did not have many opportunities. The federal government chose Minneapolis as the first city to begin the Relocation Act and open public schools to the natives. Racism towards the Native Americans was a major issue in the 1950s, when the Relocation Act was in fact. More than 100,000 Native Americans traveled to the cities, competing with other city folks for low-level jobs while increased tensions. Many of the Native Americans get a fair shot at living in the cities and felt that their lives are unlivable there. The Native Americans had been given a one-way bus ticket to the city with no easy way to return back to the reservation. Upon entering the cities, they had no realistic help when settling in, which led to poverty and the ultimate failure of the Relocation Act of 1956.
Nonconformity. Conformity is a type of social influence involving a change in belief or behavior in order to fit in with a group. Nonconformity is the failure or refusal to conform as with established customs, attitudes, or ideas. Conformity expanded during the 1950s and impacted American life. With the advent of television and influence of rock and roll, many Americans began wearing trending fashions and listening to the same music. Doing these same activities characterized the typical American. Therefore, if you didn't embrace these same activities, you were somehow un-American, especially for the American youth. American businessmen typically wore the same suits, and women wore the same fashionable outfits. A town in America eventually looked like any other American town. The rise of suburbs contributed to a conformed lifestyle, and conformity left a big impact on America due to the fact that everyone felt they had to follow a certain standard. Additionally, men were expected to work while women stayed home and raised a family. American women wanted the same material things, such as the same washer and dryer, and a desire fueled by the rise in advertising.
In response, nonconformity grew out of a counterculture that was discontent with the American normal, beginning with the beatniks. Beatniks rebelled against conformity. The Beat Generation corresponds to a literary movement heavily influenced by Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac. These authors influenced American culture and politics. The Beat generation inspired a culture of nonconformity, promoting social revolution. Many trends emerged during the 1950s. Both the beat culture and fashion and beatnik stereotype reached into the first half of the 1960s. The beatnik stereotype encouraged a trend toward suspicion and was a major impact on American youth.